They trained him to detect bombs, to save lives, and when his body broke from too many battles, they left him behind to die. But what they didn't expect was that he would survive, and he would remember. In a forgotten town wrapped in quiet streets and long shadows, a scarred German shepherd steps out of the wreckage of a life he was never meant to survive. He isn't just a dog. He's the last living witness to secrets meant to stay buried, and they will do anything to silence him. This is not just his fight anymore. It's ours. This story isn't about pity. It's about courage, loyalty, and the price of truth. If you believe forgotten heroes deserve a voice, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe to join us on this journey, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what part of Echo Story stays with you most. I love hearing your thoughts. The February air of Riverdale, Georgia, hung heavy with a sticky dampness that clung to the skin and soured the mood. At the edge of the town's rundown county shelter, a battered sign creaked under the weight of the wind, barely holding on to its rusty nails. Auction today, it proclaimed, as if the world should celebrate. But there was no celebration here, just a muddy lot, a rusted platform, and a crowd of townsfolk wrapped in thin jackets, stomping their boots against the cold. Among them, standing apart, was Amara Hayes. Her skin, the color of rich mahogany, shimmered slightly under the gray morning light, and her military-issued jacket hung loose over her compact frame. 34 years old, former combat medic, she carried an air of quiet defiance and a grief so deep it seemed stitched into her very being. She hadn't meant to stop. Driving her beat-up Ford down Highway 27, she'd seen the sign, thought maybe there'd be tools or a generator she could use on her failing farmhouse. Instead, she found herself here, arms crossed tight against her chest, surrounded by the low murmur of small-town chatter and the occasional cluck of distressed chickens. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the humid air like a whip. Next up, Lot 47, male German Shepherd, age unknown. Starting bid, $1. His voice faltered. Amara shifted, ready to leave. She had no business standing here. Her house already had an ancient Labrador named Moses, and 2 rescue cats who alternated between ignoring and terrorizing him. She didn't need another animal, much less a damaged one. Then she saw him, dragged onto the cracked concrete by a weary shelter handler. The dog was a skeleton wrapped in a dull, scarred coat. His right hind leg barely touched the ground, dragging with each miserable step, his ears pinned back, his eyes wide and glassy, scanning the faces before him with the desperate confusion of the damned. A living ghost, the auctioneer rattled on mechanically. Aggressive, not suitable for families, surrendered by previous owner. $1. Anyone? Silence answered him. Someone coughed, another shuffled their feet awkwardly. The dog pressed himself against the handler's leg, trembling so violently Amara could see it from across the lot. Might have to put this one down if there's no interest, the auctioneer added flatly, his voice heavy with disinterest. Last call, $1. Amara's hand shot up before her brave could catch up. She barely heard the auctioneer's relief to the lady in the back, as a dozen faces turned to stare at her. A black woman in a white town, buying a broken dog no one else wanted. What the hell am I doing, she thought. But her boots moved her forward, every step a defiance of reason. Echo would later name him Echo, because when their eyes met, she saw her own reflection in his haunted gaze was led to her. A leash slapped into her palm like a burden or a blessing. Up close, his condition was worse. Ribs like piano keys, patches of missing fur. A jagged scar trailed from his left shoulder down to his flank, poorly healed and puckered, like a wound that had never been tended properly. His body reeked of fear, of neglect, of battles fought and lost. "Good luck, ma'am," the handler said without warmth, before disappearing back into the cluster of shivering animals and indifferent people. Echo refused to walk. When Amara tugged gently on the leash, he collapsed onto his side, legs stiff, tail tucked so tightly between his legs it looked painful. She crouched low, ignoring the mud that soaked into her jeans, and spoke softly, the way she used to with wounded soldiers bleeding out in field hospitals overseas. "Hey buddy," she murmured. "I'm not gonna hurt you, you're coming with me, okay? Just you and me now." After endless minutes of coaxing, she managed to half lift, half carry him into the cab of her truck. Echo pressed himself so tightly against the passenger door she worried he might try to push right through it. Every rumble of the engine, every gust of wind against the windows, made him flinch violently. Amara drove with white knuckles, heart pounding harder than it should. She didn't know why she had done it, only that she had. In the rearview mirror, Riverdale shrank into a smudge of gray, but the weight of what she had done settled heavier on her shoulders. "Home, sweet home," she said when she pulled into her overgrown driveway, the words bitter and strange on her tongue. The house was a ramshackle relic, bought with the last of her combat pay, a place to disappear, a place to heal. She hadn't counted on Echo refused to get out. When she opened the door, he stayed frozen, shaking, his amber eyes darting between her and the open fields beyond. Patience, she reminded herself, 1 inch at a time. She didn't rush him, didn't force him. She simply waited, crouching nearby, murmuring nonsense until curiosity or exhaustion won out. Echo bolted not into the woods, but to the porch steps, where he collapsed into a quivering heap. Moses, her old Labrador, lumbered out, sniffed him once, then ambled back to his favorite sunspot, utterly unimpressed. Amara set out a bowl of water and some kibble, but Echo ignored both. He stayed curled tightly against the porch post, body rigid, muscles ready to snap at the slightest threat. That night, as a storm rolled in from the east, the thunder made Echo nearly claw through the living room floor. Amara sat on the hardwood beside him, speaking softly over the roar of the storm, telling him ridiculous stories about her neighbor's prize-winning pumpkins and the broken faucet that sprayed water sideways. Anything to weave a thread of normalcy into the chaos of his mind. As the rain beat down, Echo finally collapsed, exhausted, his body twitching with ghost memories. Even Amara didn't move. She sat there long after the storm passed, her own heart a battlefield of old wounds and new promises. She didn't save people anymore. That was the deal she made when she left the army behind. But somehow fate's cruel, relentless fate had thrown her a creature even more broken than herself. Maybe, just maybe this time, saving someone else could save her too. The first few days after bringing Echo home unfolded in cautious silence. A fragile ceasefire between two battered souls learning to occupy the same broken world. Amara gave him space, resisting every instinct to rush the healing process, knowing all too well that pressure shattered more than it mended. She left food near him, fresh water within reach, and soft blankets folded neatly in corners. But Echo remained a living shadow, moving only when she wasn't looking, existing in the peripheral edges of her life like a ghost unwilling to believe in sanctuary. It was during one of these tentative afternoons, when the rain had paused and thin sunlight spilled across the warped floorboards of her living room, that Amara decided to push gently. Sitting cross-legged across the room, she called to him, not with demands but with patience woven into her voice. "Hey, Echo, come here, boy," she coaxed. Nothing, only the flicker of his ears betraying that he even heard her. She tried again, softer, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Calm her," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she even consciously thought them through. German, command language, the word she had picked up from training with military canines during her last deployment. An old ghost embedded in muscle memory. Echo moved instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. His body obeyed with sharp, trained precision, crossing the room in 3 fluid strides and sitting squarely before her. Posture erect, amber eyes locked onto her face with startling focus. Amara froze, the breath catching in her chest. It wasn't just obedience. It was reflex drilled into the marrow of him, unthinking and absolute. Carefully, she tested again. "Sit." Echo sat perfectly, back straight, paws aligned. "Plats," she whispered. He dropped into a down position so smoothly it was like watching water flow downhill. A shiver crawled up her spine. This wasn't the behavior of a beaten stray or a poorly trained pet. Echo had been part of something structured, something disciplined, something military. Her heart pounded harder with every passing second. What the hell had she brought home? That evening, she sat on the porch steps, staring at the vast dark fields stretching away from her property. Echo lying at her feet, his breathing slow but restless. She turned the commands over in her mind like old coins, feeling the edges of something sharp and dangerous taking shape beneath the surface. It wasn't just the commands. It was his movements, the way he responded to sudden noises, the way his body instinctively placed itself between her and open spaces, shielding her even when trembling. This engraved training didn't fade by accident. Someone had invested years into Echo, molding him into a tool, and someone had discarded him like trash. The thought made her stomach churn. The military, contractors, some dark project gone sideways? She didn't know, yet. But the questions gnawed at her. She decided to look closer. The next morning, after Moses had been fed and the cats had been bribed into tolerating her presence with treats, Amara sat cross-legged on the floor again, Echo curled near the couch within cautious distance. Slowly, she coaxed him closer with bits of grilled chicken, a rare luxury she reserved only for building sacred trust. As he inched toward her, she gently brushed her hands along his sides, feeling the topology of his scars, the stories written in flesh. Under his left ear, hidden beneath a matted tangle of fur, her fingers found a tattoo. Tiny, crude, barely discernible through the hair and scar tissue, but there nonetheless, a series of numbers and letters, military identification style. Her pulse raced. "Jesus, Echo," she whispered, smoothing the fur back. "What were you dragged into?" She grabbed her phone, snapping a photo of the tattoo to research later, her mind spinning with possibilities, most of them bad. That night, as the sky wept another cold, drenching rain, Amara couldn't sleep. She paced the creaky floors, Echo trailing her movements from a distance like a wary sentinel. She felt exposed, as if the discovery had shifted something invisible in the house, drawing the attention of forces she couldn't name yet. And when the knock came, it was so soft she almost convinced herself she imagined it. But Moses growled low in his throat, and Echo stood stiff and alert, his nose wrinkling. Amara approached the front door cautiously, her hand resting lightly near the holster at her hip, a habit from years she thought she'd left behind. No one stood on the porch, only the rain and the breathless, anxious darkness. But pinned to the screen door, fluttering slightly in the wind, was an envelope. No address, no stamp, just her name scrawled across the front in uneven black ink. Mara's blood ran cold. She pulled it free, stepping back into the safety of the living room before tearing it open with shaking fingers. Inside, a single piece of paper. No letterhead, no signature. Just 5 words, printed neatly by hand. "Stop digging into the dog's past." She stood frozen, the letter dangling from her fingertips, the room around her tilting slightly. The walls felt too close. The air is too heavy. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who knew? Who cared? She hadn't even told anyone outside of Ben, the vet, about the commands and the tattoo. Not yet. So how did someone already know she was looking deeper? Echo whined softly at her side, his body tense, eyes flickering between her and the door. He knew. Somehow he sensed the shift, the wrongness seeping into their fragile sanctuary. Amara folded the letter, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and reached instinctively for her phone. No new messages, no missed calls, no cameras, no alarms. She was alone out here, miles from the nearest neighbor by choice. And now that isolation felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She looked at Echo, his thin body vibrating with unease, and made a decision. They needed allies. They needed answers. And most importantly, they needed to move faster than whoever was already circling like vultures in the dark. The tattoo would be the first thread to pull. Maybe it would unravel everything. Maybe it would make things worse. But doing nothing wasn't an option. Not anymore. Amara grabbed her jacket, her boots, her keys. She wasn't going to sit and wait for the storm to break over her head. She was going to meet it head on. Amara's boots crunched over the gravel of the town's municipal building parking lot as she pulled up her hood against the drizzling rain, Echo following at her side with reluctant steps. She hadn't planned to come here, not yet, but the letter had changed everything. She needed to get ahead of whatever was brewing, and that meant facing the small-town politics that she had tried so hard to avoid since settling in Riverdale. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow pallor. A handful of townsfolk loitered near the bulletin board, their conversation tapering off the moment Amara entered. She ignored the looks, the whispered exchanges, walking straight toward the front desk where a secretary with tight gray curls and a tighter smile glanced up from her crossword puzzle. "Council's in session," the woman said, without asking Amara's business, her tone clipped and disapproving. Amara dipped her chin once and pushed open the double doors to the council chamber. The room was a relic of decades past. Wood-paneled walls, rows of creaky folding chairs, and an American flag so faded it seemed more ghost than symbol. 5 council members sat behind a long, scuffed table at the front. Martina Diaz, the council president, raised an eyebrow as Amara entered. But it was the man seated to her right who caught Amara's eye. Ethan Carr, heavy-set, face perpetually red from too much bourbon or too much rage. He had run Carr's Feed and Supply for 30 years and served as an unofficial gatekeeper for who was acceptable in Riverdale. And Amara, a black woman with a soldier's bearing and no family ties to the town, was decidedly not acceptable. His gaze narrowed the moment he spotted Echo. "Miss Hayes," Diaz said coolly, folding her hands on the table. "What can we do for you?" Amara kept her tone neutral. "I'm here to address concerns about my dog." Carr leaned forward, his chair groaning under his weight. "Dangerous animal," he barked. "Already had complaints, aggressive behavior, threat to children." Amara stiffened. "Echo has not left my property unsupervised. He has not harmed anyone." Carr sneered. "Maybe not yet, but it's only a matter of time with dogs like that. Military mutts, trained to kill on command. You're gonna wait until someone's kid gets mauled before you act?" Murmurs rippled through the small audience. Amara felt her hands ball into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She took a steadying breath. "Echo is traumatized, not dangerous. He's being rehabilitated under veterinary supervision." Carr snorted. "You expect us to take that on faith?" He slapped a paper down on the table, a petition, already signed by a handful of residents. "We move to declare the animal a public nuisance. 2 weeks to remove him from town limits, or we'll proceed with seizure and euthanasia." The words struck Amara like a blow. She opened her mouth, but Diaz raised a hand. "Town council meets again next Thursday. You can present your case then. Until that time, no incidents, understood?" Amara nodded stiffly, feeling Echo press against her leg as if sensing the rising tide of hostility in the room. She turned on her heel and left without another word, the weight of their stares burning into her back. Outside, the rain had turned into a steady downpour, washing the streets clean but doing nothing to scrub away the sour taste in her mouth. She drove home in silence, Echo curled in the passenger seat, his eyes closed but his body tense. That night, she lay awake listening to the creaks and sighs of the old farmhouse settling around her, the wind rattling the window pane. The petition sat on her kitchen table, a grim reminder that the town she had tried to disappear into had no intention of letting her stay invisible. Echo paced the house, unable to settle, his claws clicking softly against the wood floors. At midnight, she finally gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when she heard a sharp, almost imperceptible pop from the backyard. Instinct overrode exhaustion. She set down the glass, moving to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer out. Darkness pressed against the glass, but she caught movement's shadow slipping near the fence line. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She moved quickly, grabbing the flashlight and the old revolver she kept in the kitchen drawer, slipping out the back door with careful, silent steps. The beam of the flashlight cut through the rain, sweeping over the yard. At first, she saw nothing. Then her light caught Echo, lying sprawled near the oak tree, his body alarmingly still. "Echo," she breathed, rushing to his side, scanning the perimeter even as she knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow but steady, his body limp. On his side, a small red dart protruded from the thin skin behind his shoulder. Tranquilizer. Fury surged through her, hot and blinding. Someone had come onto her property, had targeted Echo, had intended, what, to steal him, kill him, send a message? She yanked the dart free and tucked it into her jacket pocket, her mind racing. The dosage hadn't been enough to kill him, but a few milligrams more, and she lifted him as gently as she could, staggering slightly under his weight, and carried him back inside, locking the doors behind her with trembling hands. The vet, Ben Williams, answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but sharp with concern when she explained. He talked her through checking Echo's vitals, monitoring his breathing, reassuring her that the drug would wear off in a few hours if no complications arose. After hanging up, Amara sank onto the floor beside Echo's sleeping form, her revolver resting across her knees. She didn't know who had fired the dart. She didn't know how much farther they would go. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about town ordinances or noisy neighbors anymore. This was targeted. This was war. And whoever had drawn first blood had just made a terrible mistake. Echo stirred slightly in his sleep, his paw twitching as if chasing dreams too broken to catch. And Amara whispered into the darkness, "We're not running. Not this time." She stayed there until dawn bled gray across the horizon, listening to every creak, every sigh of the house, every whisper of rain against the roof, waiting for the next move. Morning in Riverdale brought no comfort. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a sheet of dull gray, as if mourning something unseen. Amara sat at the kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee gone cold long before she remembered to drink it. Across from her, Echo lay curled on a thick blanket she had dragged from the couch. His breathing steadier now, but his body still sluggish from the tranquilizer. She watched him with a protective ferocity that surprised even herself. Someone had come for him. Someone who knew enough to use a dart instead of a bullet. Whoever they were, they wanted Echo alive, at least for now. That thought gnawed at her worse than any bullet ever could. Her fingers drummed anxiously on the tabletop before she finally stood and moved to Echo's side. He lifted his head slightly, ears flickering toward her, a weak thump of his tail against the floor, the only sign he recognized her presence. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, sinking to her knees beside him. "Time to see what secrets you're hiding." With slow, deliberate movements, she ran her hands over his body, checking for any signs of lingering trauma from the dart. It was during that careful inspection that she noticed something she had missed before, hidden beneath the thick ruff of fur around his neck. She parted the coarse hair and her stomach twisted. Encircling Echo's neck, almost perfectly obscured unless you were looking for it, were faint but unmistakable marks. Parallel lines, some deeper than others, slightly raised and uneven. Scars from rope or wire, there ain't scars. Amara's breath hissed out between her teeth. This wasn't standard military handling. No canine unit she'd ever worked with would leave marks like this. It was too crude, too brutal. This was the work of someone who had tied Echo down, hard and long enough to scar. Someone who treated him not as a partner but as a thing to dominate and break. Rage flared hot in her chest, and for a moment she had to sit back on her heels, fists clenched, blinking against the burning in her eyes. Echo whined softly at her distress, nudging her hand with his damp nose. She smoothed his ears, her voice rough with suppressed fury. "I'm sorry, Echo. I'm so damn sorry." She needed confirmation. She needed someone she trusted to look at these wounds. Someone who could tell her how deep the damage cannot just in the skin, but in the bones. She scooped up her phone, thumbing through her contacts until she found the name she wanted. Ben Williams. The call connected after 2 rings. "Amara, everything okay?" Ben's warm, gravelly voice always reminded her of Riverstone's, solid and worn by time. "No," she said, swallowing hard. "I need you to come by. It's Echo, there's something wrong." Ben didn't ask questions, he just said, "I'm on my way." 30 minutes later, his battered pickup rumbled into her driveway. Ben climbed out, a man in his early 50s with a slight limp from an old rodeo injury, and hands that were gentle even when life demanded hardness. He carried a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder, and wore the same faded flannel shirt he always wore when he expected bad news. Inside, Echo lifted his head but didn't move. His eyes tracked Ben warily, but there was no growl, no bark, only a resigned sort of wariness that made Amara's chest ache even more. Ben knelt beside him, murmuring soothing nonsense as he unpacked a portable scanner, a stethoscope, a penlight. He worked methodically, checking Echo's vitals, palpating along his spine and limbs with fingers that knew how to find pain without causing more of it. When he reached Echo's neck, he paused. His fingers traced the scars Amara had uncovered. His mouth tightened into a grim line. "These aren't from a standard canine collar," he said quietly, glancing up at her. This dog was tied down repeatedly, probably with something rough, wire maybe. Rope at the very least. His mire nodded, feeling a sick sort of vindication alongside her anger. Ben gave her a look she couldn't quite read, and moved down Echo's body, gently manipulating the injured limb. Echo flinched but didn't pull away. Ben frowned deeper. There's an old fracture here. Tibia, maybe fibula too. Didn't set properly. No surgical intervention. Probably just wrapped or splinted in the field. Amara's heart sank. Improperly healed bone meant constant pain, restricted movement, a lifetime of compensation. It was negligence, no worse, it was cruelty. She had seen this kind of treatment before, not on battlefields but in the aftermath of battles, in makeshift refugee camps where resources were stretched too thin and humanity was a currency no one could afford. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms. "How bad is it?" she asked, voice rough. Ben hesitated. "He's functional, for now. But he's got arthritis already setting in. He's going to need supplements. Probably pain management long-term. Maybe even surgery down the line if it gets worse." Amara nodded slowly, absorbing the words like body blows. Echo shifted his weight, pressing his head against her knee, seeking comfort without asking for it. Ben sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Amara, whatever happened to this dog, it wasn't just abandonment. Someone hurt him, deliberately. And if you're asking my professional opinion, this wasn't an accident. It was systematic." She closed her eyes for a long moment, steadying the hurricane of emotions swirling inside her. When she opened them again, her voice, medical notes, official record. Ben nodded once, the gravity of the situation clear between them. Already started. He rose, gathering his things. "Be careful," he said as he slung his bag over his shoulder. "If someone went to the trouble of trying to tranquilize him, they're not going to stop now." She saw him to the door, locking it tight behind him, feeling the house grow smaller and smaller around her. Echo rested at her feet, his body a map of old battles and silent endurance. She couldn't undo the past that had been carved into his flesh, but she could fight for the future that still hung, precarious, before them. In the fading light of afternoon, she sat down at the kitchen table, spread out the photos Ben had taken, the notes he had scribbled, the ugly truth of Echo's suffering laid bare in black and white. She tapped her fingers restlessly on the tabletop, her mind racing. Somewhere out there, someone who still saw him not as a living being, but as a liability that needed erasing. And if she didn't move fast, they were going to come back. Next time, they might not just come for Echo. They might come for her too. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping back across the floor, heart hammering as she moved toward the dusty old filing cabinet she hadn't touched in months, digging out files, old contacts, names she swore she would never need again. Because if she wanted to uncover who had hurt Echo, and why, she would have to step back into a world she had fought so hard to leave behind. A world where rules were bent, loyalties bought, and justice was a currency far too rare. The decision weighed on Amara like a second skin as she sat hunched over her old laptop, the glow of the screen the only light in the darkened farmhouse. The storm had passed outside, but inside her mind the winds howled louder than ever. The photos Ben had taken lay fanned out beside her, a grim testament to the suffering Echo had endured. If she wanted to protect him, if she wanted to protect herself, she needed to know exactly what they were up against. With Echo dozing fitfully on a rug nearby, she opened her old contacts file and started digging. She reached out first to an old friend from Fort Bragg, a cybersecurity specialist who owed her more favors than he liked to admit. She sent a simple, encrypted message. "Need intel. Blackthorn unit. Any trace?" She didn't expect an immediate answer, so she turned her attention to open sources, scouring news articles, military records, declassified missions. Hours blurred past in a haze of coffee and frustration. Blackthorn, it was like chasing smoke. Every mention of the unit seemed to... No deployment records, no commendations, no casualty lists. In the official archives of the U.S. military, Blackthorn might as well have never existed. Amara leaned back, rubbing her eyes, mind racing. She had seen Black Ops units before, had patched up soldiers who didn't exist on paper, whose wounds were classified, whose medals were handed out in secret. But even the most covert teams left a whisper behind. Blackthorn left nothing. Her laptop chimed with a new message, a tiny thrill of adrenaline shooting through her veins. It was from her contact. One line of text blinked on the screen. Blackthorn wiped, complete purge, no surviving files. Someone wanted them erased. She stared at the words, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't normal protocol. Units didn't just disappear from existence, unless something had gone catastrophically wrong, or unless someone needed to bury something too dangerous to risk surfacing. She typed back quickly. Personnel list, anything? The answer came minutes later. No names, but rumors. Blackthorn specialized in non-standard retrieval ops. Not official policy, very dirty. Amara closed her laptop, heart pounding in her chest. She looked over at Echo, his body rising and falling with shallow breaths, oblivious to the magnitude of the storm gathering around them. What had they made him do? And why was someone willing to kill to keep it secret? She didn't have long to ponder the question. Just after sunrise, as she was feeding Moses and refilling the cat's water bowls, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Every nerve in her body tightened like a drawn wire. She wiped her hands on her jeans and answered. Hello? Silence for a beat. Then a low, gravelly voice said, Is this Amara Hayes? Who's asking? She countered, instincts flaring. Name's Tariq Johnson, the voice said. You don't know me, but I knew Blackthorn. I knew your dog. She froze, the phone slick in her hand. Echo? Delta 7, the man said, using a designation that sent a chill down her spine. I served with him, not as a handler, but I was attached to operations. I know what they made him do. I know why they want him silenced. Amara moved toward the window, scanning the fields beyond her property, half expecting black SUVs to appear out of the mist. Why are you contacting me? She asked tightly. Because you're the only one standing between him and people who want him dead. And because if they're coming for him, they'll come for you next. His words were a gut punch she had been bracing for without knowing it. She tightened her grip on the phone. What do you know? Tariq hesitated, as if weighing the cost of continuing. Blackthorn wasn't just Black Ops, he said finally. It was off the books completely. Private backers, experimental missions. Delta 7 and others like him weren't just detection dogs. They were trained for high-use retrieval, hostage extraction, sabotage, cleaning up assets. Things too dirty even for the usual Special Forces channels. Amara's blood ran cold. You're saying Echo was used for assassinations? I'm saying, Tariq replied, voice grim, that whatever you think you know about military K9S, Blackthorn, they modified training protocols, psychological conditioning, chemical enhancements. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. Delta 7 Echo was one of the successes, until he wasn't. The house seemed to tilt around her. What happened? She rasped. Another pause. There was a mission, a failure, high collateral. Echo broke protocol, refused to engage. They called it a malfunction. I called it a conscience. Amara pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself. And then they tried to reprogram him, Tariq said flatly. When it didn't work, they shelved him, transferred him to a rehabilitation contractor. That's when he disappeared. You finding him, that wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to be collateral damage. He was supposed to vanish. Amara's mind reeled, connecting dots she hadn't dared fully acknowledge before. The scars, the broken leg, the terror in Echo's eyes when the thunder rolled. Why are you telling me this? She demanded. Because I owe him, Tariq said simply, and because you have a chance to do what none of us could, bring the truth to light. But you need to move fast. They know you're digging. The line went dead before she could ask more. She stared at the phone, breathing hard, the weight of Tariq's revelations pressing down on her like a physical force. Echo whimpered softly in his sleep, legs twitching in some Amara crossed the room and knelt beside him, burying her hands in his thick fur. We're gonna find the truth, Echo, she whispered fiercely. No matter how deep they buried it. Outside, the first hints of dawn sliced through the mist, cold and sharp as a blade. Somewhere out there, the shadows that had created Echo's nightmare world were stirring, sensing that their secrets were no longer safe. And Amara, stubborn and furious and unafraid, were preparing to rip those secrets into the light. By mid-morning, the tension in Amara's chest felt like a loaded gun pressed against her ribs. The information Tariq had shared burned in her mind, fuse lit and hissing toward an inevitable explosion. She couldn't sit idle anymore. If they were coming for Echo, for her, then she needed to move first. She began compiling everything, the photos, Ben's veterinary reports, The notes from her contact about Blackthorn's erasure and Tariq's testimony recorded carefully in a secure app. She knew this wasn't enough to bring the machine down, but it was enough to rattle it, enough to make them second-guess their next move. As she worked, a knock sounded at the front door, startling her so badly she almost knocked over the laptop. Echo was on his feet instantly, posture rigid but not aggressive, nose twitching as he sampled the air. Amara approached the door cautiously, peeking through the side window. A man stood there, early 40s maybe, tall and lean with the casual stance of someone trained to look harmless. He wore jeans, a plain sweatshirt and a ball cap pulled low over brown eyes that missed nothing. In his hand he held a badge, Army Liaison Officer, Fort Benning. She opened the door a cautious few inches, the chain still latched. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, a quick flash of teeth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Hayes, Lieutenant Marcus Reed, I'm part of the Community Outreach Division over at Benning. Heard there's been some..." Alarm bells screamed in Amara's head, but she masked it behind a neutral expression. "Didn't ask for help," she said evenly. Reed shrugged, still smiling. "Command thought it might be best. Lot of tension around town right now. Rumors flying. We just want to make sure you and the dog are safe." His words were polished, rehearsed. Amara knew a cover story when she heard one. She considered slamming the door in his face. Instead, she unlatched the chain and opened the door fully, stepping aside. "Fine, come in." Reed entered with the careful steps of someone trained to scan rooms instinctively. His gaze swept the space, cataloging exits, windows, obstacles. Echo stood at Amara's side, watching Reed with narrowed amber eyes, his body a taut wire of suspicion. "Nice dog," Reed commented, crouching slightly but not reaching out. "What's his name?" "Echo," Amara said. "You said you're here to help. What exactly does that mean?" Reed straightened, flashing another thin smile. "Just making sure no one's trying to take advantage of the situation. Offering support if you need it. Paperwork, vet resources, training consultants, things like that." Amara nodded slowly, playing along. "Appreciate it." Reed's eyes flickered briefly to Echo's neck, where the scars lay hidden beneath his thick coat. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. "Not a cap." Amara's stomach clenched tighter. She needed to get him out of here before he found something he could use against them. "I'll let you know if I need anything," she said pointedly, moving toward the door. Reed took the hint, offering a polite nod as he stepped back outside. "You do that, Miss Hayes. Stay safe now." She locked the door the moment he was off the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. Reed wasn't out. He was surveillance. They were closer than she thought. That afternoon, the tension in town hit a breaking point. Amara had driven into Riverdale to pick up supplies from the hardware store, Echo riding shotgun, more alert than usual. She knew she was being watched, evaluated, judged. Most of the town still saw Echo as a ticking time bomb, a liability. It made what happened next all the more devastating and all the more perfect. Amara was loading bags of fencing wire into her truck when the first scream tore through the parking lot. She whipped around in time to see two men in dark hoodies grappling with a small girl near the alley behind the hardware store. Her brain registered three things almost simultaneously. The girl was Aaliyah Carr, Ethan Carr's granddaughter. The men were trying to drag her into a waiting van, and no one was moving to help. Echo exploded from the cab before Amara could even open her mouth. He hit the ground running, a streak of black and gold muscle, moving with terrifying precision. One of the men caught sight of him too late. Echo launched, jaws locking onto the man's arm with a sickening crunch. The kidnapper screamed, releasing Aaliyah, who stumbled backward, wide-eyed and terrified. The second man pulled a knife, but Echo was already shifting, positioning himself between Aaliyah and the attackers, snarling low and deep. Amara sprinted toward them, shouting, "Drop it! Police are coming!" Whether it was the sight of Echo or the approaching siren, someone must have called 911. The men bolted, leaving their van door swinging open. Echo didn't pursue. He stayed with Aaliyah, circling her protectively, body still vibrating with tension. Amara reached them seconds later, dropping to her knees beside the trembling girl. "You're safe now," she said urgently. "You're okay." Aaliyah threw her arms around Echo's neck, sobbing into his fur. Echo stood rigid for a moment, then leaned into her with a soft whine, tail wagging hesitantly. By the time the police arrived, half the town had gathered, drawn by the noise and flashing lights, and they saw Echo sitting quietly beside Elia, who refused to leave his side, clutching his collar like a lifeline. They saw the blood on Echo's muzzle, not from viciousness, but from protecting one of their own. Ethan Carr pushed through the crowd, face pale and drawn. When he spotted Elia and Echo together, something broke across his weathered features. Disbelief, relief, gratitude. For a long suspended moment, no one spoke. Then Elia lifted her tear-streaked face and said clearly, "Echo saved me." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Eyes that had once looked at Echo with suspicion now filled with awe. Sheriff Winslow approached, his expression unreadable. He knelt to examine Echo, then glanced up at Amara. "He okay?" She nodded, too choked up to speak. Winslow rose, scanning the gathered townspeople. "This dog just saved a child's life. I expect everyone here remembers that the next time someone calls him dangerous." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Ethan Carr stepped forward, removing his hat and clutching it in both hands. He met Amara's gaze across the distance. "Thank you," he said hoarsely, voice cracking under the weight of emotion. Amara inclined her head stiffly, aware that trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild. But today, Echo had given them something stronger than fear. He had given them hope. That night, as Amara sat on her porch with Echo stretched at her feet, she watched the stars emerge one by one in the clear night sky and wondered how long this fragile peace would last before the next storm broke over them. For a few brief days, it almost seemed like things were settling. People in Riverdale nodded at Amara in passing, some even offering tentative smiles. And Echo was no longer the monster whispered about in grocery store aisles. Instead, he had become the town's quiet hero, the dog who had saved a little girl and stood his ground against fear itself. Amara knew better than to trust peace like that. She felt it in her bones, the tension crackling under the surface like a dry forest before the strike of lightning. And sure enough, the storm came, roaring into their lives on a night so still it felt wrong from the start. It was after midnight when Amara jolted awake, disoriented, heart pounding. Echo was already on his feet, growling low, his body tense beside the bed. The acrid sting of smoke hit her nose a second later, and adrenaline surged through her veins like fire. She was out of bed and yanking open the curtains in an instant. Orange flickered at the edge of the property line, where her old barn and animal pen stood, silhouettes wreathed in smoke and flame. She didn't stop to think. She grabbed her boots, her jacket, the revolver, and sprinted into the night with Echo at her side. The air outside was thick and choking, heat blasting her skin as she skidded across the wet grass toward the barn. Flames licked the sky, greedy and wild, crackling loud enough to drown out the pounding of her own heartbeat. The smell of burning wood and scorched earth filled her mouth, made her gag. Through the chaos, she registered the animals' terrified cries. Moses the horse kicking at his stall, the goats bleating in panic. "Echo, stay," she commanded, pointing to a safe spot away from the barn. She didn't want him anywhere near the collapsing structure. He hesitated, torn, but obeyed, muscles coiled tight with frustration. Amara plunged into the barn, the heat slamming into her like a wall. She fumbled with latches, coughing, barely able to see. She freed the goats first, shooing them toward the open pasture where they scattered like sparks into the night. Moses was harder. He was panicked, wide-eyed, nostrils flaring. She threw open his stall, grabbed his halter, and yanked with everything she had, dragging the big gelding toward the exit, just as the roof groaned ominously above them. They barely made it out before a beam collapsed in a shower of embers behind them. Amara staggered back, Moses pulling free and bolting across the field, but she didn't care. They were alive. She turned to Echo, who whined urgently, ears pinned back, scanning the shadows beyond the fire's glow. He wasn't looking at the barn. He was looking at the house. She sprinted back toward it, lungs burning, echoes surging ahead of her. The house seemed intact, but something gleamed in the grass near the porch steps. A glass bottle, broken, with a rag still smoldering inside it. A Molotov cocktail. She crushed the embers with her boot, heart hammering, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was war. The volunteer fire department arrived minutes later, sirens wailing. Their efforts focused on containing the blaze before it spread. Sheriff Winslow showed up not long after, his face grim as he surveyed the wreckage. "This was no accident," he said, crouching to examine the remnants of the Molotov. "Someone wanted you scared or gone." Amara nodded, numb. She knew exactly who they were dealing with. It wasn't just the town anymore. It was bigger. It was whoever had built Blackthorn, whoever wanted Echo buried along with the truth he carried in every scar on his battered body. Later, as dawn crept over the ruins of her barn, Amara sat on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Echo pressed against her side. The fire crews were gone, leaving only smoldering rubble behind. Winslow lingered, hat in hand, reluctant to leave her alone. "I'll post a patrol nearby," he said. "But Amara, you need more than that. You need protection." She nodded absently, her mind already spinning toward the next move. She wasn't going to wait for them to strike again. She was going to force their hand. That afternoon, she made contact with Calvin Brooks, the man Tariq had told her about, Echo's former handler before Marcus Cooper. Calvin had been discharged 2 years ago under circumstances as murky as the rest of Blackthorn's history. But he had stayed local, operating a small training kennel just outside Columbus. When Amara called, he answered on the first ring, his voice tight with nerves but resolute. "Got Athai?" he asked without preamble. "Guy got him," she said. "And I've got proof of what they did. But I need your testimony." There was a long pause. She heard him exhale shakily. "I knew this day was coming. I didn't think I'd have the guts to stand up when it did." "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "We can fight them, but we have to stand together." Another beat of silence. Then, "All right, meet me tomorrow, 11 a.m., Riverwalk Park, public place, safe." "I'll be there," she promised. She hung up, hope fluttering in her chest for the first time in what felt like forever. If Calvin came forward, if he confirmed Echo's past, they could blow this wide open. They could make it impossible for Fort Benning or Blackthorn's ghosts to deny what they had done. That night, Amara didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the driveway, the fields, the tree line. Echo sat with her, silent, vigilant, sensing the tension that thrummed through her like a live wire. Morning came gray and heavy with mist. She loaded Echo into the truck and headed into town, heart pounding with anticipation. But when she arrived at Riverwalk Park, the place was wrong. Too empty, too quiet. She circled twice before pulling into a spot near the river's edge. She waited. 10 minutes. 15. At exactly 11:15, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered instantly. "Calvin, wrong move, soldier. You should have stayed out of this." The line went dead. Dread slammed into her chest. She grabbed the phone, trying to trace the call, but it was already scrambled. She was about to call Winslow when Echo's head snapped up, nose in the air, body stiffening. Then she saw it across the river. Half hidden by the trees, a flash of movement. 2 men dragging a limp figure toward a waiting SUV. Calvin. She bolted from the truck, shouting, but the engine roared to life and the vehicle peeled away, disappearing into the maze of back roads leading out of town. She stood there panting, fists clenched uselessly at her sides, helpless fury bubbling over. They had taken Calvin, silenced him before he could speak, and now she was truly alone. The minutes after Calvin's abduction stretched into a frozen eternity for Amara. Standing there by the river, Echo pacing at her side, tension vibrating through every muscle. She knew panic was useless, a luxury she could not afford, so she shoved it down deep and forced herself to think. Whoever had taken Calvin wasn't just sending a message. They were erasing anyone who could testify against them. It meant one thing: they were desperate, and desperate enemies made mistakes. She loaded Echo into the truck and peeled out of the park, dialing Winslow on the way, giving him the barest facts, omitting names and details she wasn't ready to trust to unsecured lines. "Be careful," Winslow warned before hanging up. "They're getting sloppy, but that makes them dangerous." Back at the farmhouse, Amara spread out everything she had collected. The military files, Tariq's notes, the vet records, even the threatening letters she had kept. She stared at the mess, willing it to form some kind of map, some breadcrumb trail she could follow. The name loomed largest of all in her mind now. Cerberus Security. Tariq had mentioned them once, in a low voice edged with hate. A private military contractor rumored to have picked up the scraps left behind when Blackthorn was officially disbanded. If Echo Scars had a signature, it would be theirs. She dug into every dark corner of the internet she knew, bypassing firewalls and hunting buried forums frequented by whistleblowers and veterans too angry or too broken to keep. Threads emerged slowly, ugly and tangled. Cerberus specialized in adaptive asset integration, a bland euphemism masking a far grimmer reality. They took military dogs, ones deemed too damaged, too unstable, too valuable to let go, and retrained them using methods so brutal most didn't survive the transition. Those who did became weapons, not partners, living tools for covert operations that no official army would sanction. Assassinations, blackmail retrievals, corporate espionage. If Echo had survived Cerberus, it was a miracle. And if Cerberus wanted him back or silenced, it was because he was more than just a liability. He was a witness. She needed proof. Hard proof, something no PR machine or government lawyer could spin. Something they couldn't bury. That night, after securing the property with what few defenses she could muster, Amara sat on the porch steps with Echo beside her, both staring into the darkness like soldiers on watch. She turned the metal tag in her hand, the one Marcus Cooper had given her, and an idea sparked in her mind. It was a long shot, a desperate one, but desperate was all she had left. Fort Benning had decommissioned facilities, training yards and outbuildings left to rot when budgets shifted or priorities changed. If Cerberus had operated close to Blackthorn, if they needed to hide dirty work but still keep it accessible, that's where they would have set up. She checked old schematics Tariq had sent her, cross-referenced them with aerial maps and found it. A cluster of warehouses just outside the official base perimeter, abandoned for 5 years, theoretically under no one's jurisdiction. Perfect for off-the-books operations and possibly still hiding secrets. She didn't wait for daylight. She loaded Echo into the truck, grabbed her flashlight, her revolver, a battered first aid kit, and drove into the night. The roads grew narrower and rougher as she left Riverdale behind, the trees crowding closer, headlights slicing through mist and branches. Echo sat rigid beside her, ears perked, body tense, as if he understood exactly how important this was. They reached the perimeter of the abandoned zone just past midnight. She killed the headlights and coasted the last 100 yards in darkness, parking behind a thicket of overgrown brush. Ahead, the warehouses loomed hulking shapes against the starless sky, their metal siding rusted and pitted, roofs sagging in places. Amara slipped out of the truck, keeping low, checking her surroundings. Nothing moved. No guards, no patrols. It was too quiet. She clicked her tongue softly. Echo slipped from the cab and ranged ahead, his nose working furiously, his body a shadow among shadows. They circled the main warehouse, windows boarded, doors chained, graffiti scrawled across the metal skin like angry wounds. But Echo didn't stop there. He kept moving, snout to the ground, tail rigid. He led her to a smaller building tucked behind the main complex, half canased in, one wall caved in from years of neglect. Echo froze at the threshold, ears straining forward, body vibrating with suppressed energy. Amara crept up beside him, peering through the jagged hole in the wall. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, broken crates, rotting files, rusted equipment. But beyond that, deeper in the shadows, something gleamed faintly under her flashlight's narrow beam. A metal filing cabinet. Forgotten. She squeezed through the gap, heart hammering, Echo at her side. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She reached the cabinet, brushed away years of dust and grime, and found the drawer unlocked. Inside were folders, dozens of them, labeled not with names, but with numbers and designations she recognized from Tariq's files. Delta Series, Omega Directive, Blackthorn Consolidation. Her hands shook as she flipped through them. Detailed reports, conditioning logs, medical experiments, deployment records signed not by Army officials but by Cerberus executives. Proof of the unauthorized operations. Proof of the program that had created and then discarded Echo. Proof they would kill to keep buried. Echo whined sharply, snapping her out of her stunned haze. She stuffed as many folders as she could into her backpack, snapping pictures of the rest with her phone in case she couldn't get them all out. Just as she was zipping the bag closed, Echo stiffened, head turning toward the broken wall they had entered through. Mara froze. Footsteps, approaching fast, heavy, coordinated. They weren't alone anymore. The moment Amara heard the footsteps closing in, every instinct screamed at her to run. But she forced herself to move carefully, silently, retreating deeper into the shadows of the broken warehouse. Echo stayed glued to her side, his muscles coiled, his breathing low and controlled. Through a jagged gap in the crumbling wall, she glimpsed figures slipping through the mist, silhouettes armed and moving with practiced efficiency. These weren't random thugs. They were trained, disciplined, Cerberus operatives. She clutched the backpack tighter, every document inside it now feeling like a live grenade. If they caught her, they wouldn't arrest her. They wouldn't negotiate. They would erase her. Echo nudged her hand urgently, sensing the rising danger, and she understood his silent message. They had to move now. She edged toward the rear of the building, searching for another way out, when a sudden beam of flashlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping the interior. Shouts erupted, sharp and commanding, and the hunt was on. Heart hammering, she sprinted toward the far wall where a section of the foundation had buckled, creating a narrow tunnel barely big enough to squeeze through. She shoved Echo ahead of her, scraping her elbows raw on broken concrete as she crawled, the sound of boots pounding closer with every heartbeat. They burst out into the night, into the thick underbrush behind the compound, and ran, not daring to look back. They didn't stop until they reached the truck. Amara flung open the door, threw the backpack inside, and they peeled away into the night, the tires spitting gravel in their wake. For the next hour, she drove aimlessly through back roads, changing direction at random, trying to shake any possible tail. Finally, when her arms ached from gripping the wheels so tightly and Echo's panting filled the cab, she pulled into a derelict rest stop miles outside Riverdale. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She pulled out her phone, called Winslow. "They know," she rasped. "They're coming." Winslow didn't ask how she knew. His voice was grim. "Get back here, we're already getting reports." Military vehicles spotted heading toward town. Not just MPs, black SUVs, tactical gear. Cerberus, she whispered, cold dread settling in her gut. "And they're bringing the army as cover." "Looks that way," Winslow confirmed. "We're setting up a perimeter, but Amara, you better be ready." She hung up, hands trembling. She had known this would come, but not so fast, not so brutal. Echo whined softly, sensing her fear. She reached out and buried her fingers in his thick fur. "We're not running," she said. "Not this time." She gunned the truck back toward Riverdale, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, a cruel contrast to the darkness descending on their lives. By the time she reached the edge of town, chaos was already unfolding. Sheriff's deputies were posted at intersections, trying to divert traffic, but it was clear they were outmanned and outgunned. Black-clad soldiers moved methodically down Main Street, corralling curious onlookers, flashing forged federal orders declaring a classified operation. And at the center of it all, parked like a black heart beating poison into the town's veins, was a convoy of SUVs and armored personnel carriers. Amara gritted her teeth and drove straight toward them. She parked near the courthouse, where a small knot of townsfolk had gathered, Ethan Carr among them, his face grim. He nodded at her in silent solidarity as she stepped out with Echo at her side. The soldiers noticed her instantly. A man in a crisp uniform she didn't recognize strode forward, flanked by two Cerberus operatives. He carried himself with authority, but his eyes betrayed impatience and calculation. "Mrs. Hayes," he barked, "by order of the United States Army and affiliated security contractors, you are hereby ordered to surrender the military asset known as Delta 7 for immediate retrieval and reassignment." The crowd murmured uneasily. Amara stepped forward, voice clear. "His name is Echo, and he's not an asset. He's a veteran, legally retired." The man sneered. "That paperwork is invalid. You are harboring government property. If you do not comply, we are authorized to use force." Echo growled low in his throat, the sound reverberating through the air like a warning shot. Sheriff Winslow stepped up beside her, his hand resting lightly on his sidearm. "You'll have to go through us first," he said evenly. For a moment, the standoff teetered on a knife's edge, violence crackling in the air, one wrong move away from exploding. And then, from the far side of the crowd, a figure stumbled into view, bloodied, limping, but very much alive, Calvin Brooks. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, but he clutched something to his chest like it was more precious than gold. A battered manila envelope. "Not so fast," Calvin croaked, holding up the envelope. This Echo was officially retired from military service before the Blackthorn shutdown. Signed, sealed, witness it. The man's face blanched. Calvin shoved past the soldiers, thrusting the documents into Winslow's hands. "Originals," he panted. "Not copies, certified. You touch that dog now, you're committing felony assault against a civilian's legally owned property." Winslow flipped through the pages rapidly, his lips tightening into a grim smile. "Looks authentic to me," he said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. The tension shifted palpably. The townsfolk, sensing blood in the water, pressed closer. Phones came out, cameras recording. Suddenly, it wasn't a simple retrieval mission anymore. It was a public relations nightmare. The officer stiffened, jaw flexing. "He's still classified as and if you try to take him, you'll answer to the law and the press." He nodded subtly toward the line of news vans that had materialized at the end of the block, summoned by some unseen hand. Maybe Jake Thornton? Maybe someone else who believed in the cause. It didn't matter. What mattered was that now the world was watching. The officer muttered into his radio, scowling, and after a long, tense moment, the soldiers began to pull back, their retreat cloaked in bureaucratic language and tight faces. Cerberus's operatives lingered a moment longer, their stares promising that this wasn't over, that next time there would be no cameras, no witnesses. But for now they withdrew. Calvin sagged against the courthouse steps, exhausted but alive. Amara crouched beside him, Echo pressing against both of them with a low whine. "You came back," she whispered, awe and relief choking her voice. "Had to," Calvin said, grinning painfully. "Couldn't let them take him. Couldn't let them win." The sun broke through the clouds overhead, casting golden light over the battered little town that had just dared to stand against giants. But Amara knew, deep in her bones, that this battle, as fierce as it had been, was only a prelude to the war still to come. The aftermath of the standoff left Riverdale changed forever. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire, first through local media, then to national outlets hungry for a story of resilience and defiance against shadowy forces. Articles flooded the internet, headlines splashed across front pages. "Small town stands up for forgotten Farathal. Forget the names, get spoils behind the eloped, dark punishment for murder. To lead the four behind the elite dark." Echo's name became a rallying cry. Photos of him sitting proudly next to Amara on the courthouse steps, tail wagging gently despite the chaos, went viral overnight. Veterans groups, animal rights organizations, and ordinary citizens flooded Riverdale with letters, donations, offers of support. They didn't just see a dog, they saw a symbol, a survivor who had endured betrayal and brutality yet still chose to protect and love. Murals appeared on walls in town, Echo silhouetted against the sunrise, Echo curled protectively around Aaliyah's sleeping form, Echo standing defiantly against faceless oppressors. Amara found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't intended to start. Her quiet determination and unwavering defense of Echo capturing hearts far beyond Georgia. Invitations to speak poured in, from veteran support conferences to national TV interviews. She declined most of them, choosing instead to focus on building something tangible. With donations and grants, she founded the Redemption Projecta Rehabilitation and Adoption Center for military working dogs, abandoned or retired without proper care. Echo, of course, was the face of it all. He took to the role with a solemn grace that broke Amara's heart anew every time she watched him interact with visiting families, children, other veterans broken in different ways. He had found his purpose again, and through him, so had she. Sheriff Winslow continued to keep a watchful eye on town security, but the overt threats faded as Cerberus found themselves mired in scandal and legal action. Investigations were launched, contracts severed, executives arrested. Though Amara knew better than to believe all the rot had been rooted out, it was enough for now to buy them peace. Calvin Brooks remained in town, quietly assisting with the Redemption Project while rebuilding his own shattered life. He rarely spoke of what had been done to him, but every time he glanced at Echo, a haunted understanding passed between them, a silent promise to never let such horrors happen again. As for Riverdale itself, it changed too. Suspicion and fear gave way to pride. Echo wasn't just tolerated. He was celebrated. At the annual Founders Day parade, he was the guest of honor, riding in a flower-strewn truck bed while children waved banners and veterans saluted from the sidewalks. When the mayor presented Amara and Echo with the key to the city, she caught Ethan Carr in the crowd, clapping just as hard as anyone, his granddaughter perched on his shoulders, wearing a t-shirt that read Team Echo. It would have been a perfect ending if life worked like fairy tales, but Amara knew better. On a rainy afternoon weeks later, while organizing the remaining files salvaged from the abandoned Cerberus warehouse, she found it, a single flash drive wedged deep in the lining of her backpack, so small and unremarkable she might have missed it entirely. She plugged it into an offline laptop in the clinic's back room, heart thudding with the old familiar rhythm of danger. Most of the drive contained what she already knew: conditioning logs, deployment records, but hidden in a buried folder was something else. A file labeled Project Lazarus. Her stomach turned over. She clicked it open, breath-catching as the documents unfolded on screen. Lazarus wasn't just about repurposing damaged dogs. It was about enhancing them. Genetic manipulation, illegal surgeries, neural conditioning experiments designed to create living weapons that could be remotely controlled or chemically triggered. And worse, there were lists names she recognized from the Redemption Project's intake files. Dogs who had shown strange behaviors, unexplained aggression, cognitive dissonance. Some of them had already been adopted by well-meaning families. Unknowing, vulnerable. Amara stared at the screen, the weight of what she had uncovered pressing down on her like the roof of a collapsing building. Echo whined softly from where he lay at her feet, sensing her distress. She reached down, running her hand over his strong, scarred back. "They tried to break you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "And you survived. But the battle wasn't over, not yet." She copied the files onto multiple secure drives, already planning her next moves. Cerberus might have been wounded, but the monster behind Project Lazarus still lurked in the dark, waiting to strike again unless someone dragged their secrets into the light. Amara closed the laptop, her jaw setting in that stubborn line that had carried her through war zones and witch hunts alike. She rose, Echo immediately falling into step beside her, ready for whatever came next. Together they stepped out into the storm, not as fugitives, not as survivors, but as warriors carrying a banner no bullet could destroy. Truth, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and her dog. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low and hungry, but Amara didn't flinch. She welcomed the coming storm. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. I'm curious what part of Echo's journey hit you the hardest, and where are you watching from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.